The night my sister told me to get out of her house started like any other Tuesday. Nothing dramatic, no warning signs, just another normal evening in Tampa. I had been back in Florida for about 3 weeks after finishing a long deployment in Europe. My unit handled logistics planning for supply movement across several bases, which sounds boring until you realize half the military stops functioning if the logistics fail. It's not glamorous work, but it's the kind of job where thousands of people suddenly care if you make a mistake. After years in the Army, you learn something simple. Chaos usually starts quietly. That night, I pulled into my sister Melissa's driveway just after 6. The Florida humidity was doing its usual thing, wrapping around everything like a warm, wet blanket. The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left earlier that morning, 2 stories, beige siding palm tree out front that Melissa liked to remind everyone she had planted herself. Inside the house, the television was on in the living room. One of the boys had left a backpack in the hallway. The smell of garlic and tomato sauce drifted out of the kitchen. Normal house, normal evening. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door. Melissa's younger son, Caleb, ran past me wearing socks and sliding across the tile floor like he was in the Olympics. His older brother, Ethan, followed behind him yelling something about a stolen video game controller. Kids. Loud, chaotic, completely unaware of adult problems. Melissa stood in the kitchen stirring pasta. Her husband, Greg, leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "Long day?" Greg asked, without looking up. "Not bad," I answered. That was mostly true. My days lately had been quiet compared to deployment life. I was waiting for reassignment paperwork from the Army. And in the meantime, my schedule mostly involved medical checkups and administrative nonsense. A few weeks earlier, a doctor had noticed a minor heart rhythm issue during a routine exam. Nothing dramatic, no surgery, no emergency, just something they wanted to monitor for a few months. Military doctors like to watch things. Dinner was simple. Pasta salad and garlic bread that Caleb managed to burn slightly while trying to help. The conversation bounced between school complaints, real estate gossip from Melissa's job, and Greg's endless stories about traffic. Typical family dinner. I had been living there for about 3 months while sorting out my reassignment orders. Every month I gave Melissa $2,500 toward groceries, utilities, and the mortgage. I made sure of that from the beginning. Living with family is easier when everyone agrees it's not charity. Melissa never argued about the money. She just accepted the envelope every month and slid it into the kitchen drawer where she kept the bills. The dinner plates were mostly empty when the conversation shifted. Greg asked about my doctor appointment earlier that day. "So what did they say about the heart thing?" he asked. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just monitoring it for a while." Melissa paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "What does monitoring mean? Just regular checkups?" She didn't look reassured. "Is this something serious?" "Not really," I said. "The Army doctors see stuff like this all the time." That answer didn't seem to help. Melissa set her fork down and leaned back in her chair. "I just don't want medical emergencies happening here." The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Greg glanced at her. "Melissa, what she said?" "I'm being realistic." I took a sip of water and stayed quiet. "Military life teaches patience," Melissa continued. "We have 2 kids in this house. I'm not equipped to deal with medical situations." "It's not that kind of situation," I said. "That's what people always say before it becomes a situation." Her tone had changed. The boys had stopped talking. Even Greg looked uncomfortable. "Melissa," he said quietly, "it's just a checkup thing." But Melissa had already shifted into one of those moods where logic doesn't slow anything down. "I just think it's something we need to talk about," she said. "What do we need to talk about?" I asked. Her voice got louder. "This living situation." The boys looked back and forth between us. "Maybe this isn't the best place for you right now," Melissa said. The room went quiet. "Why wouldn't it be?" I asked. Melissa pushed her chair back from the table. "Because I don't want this house turning into a hospital." Greg rubbed his forehead. "Melissa, I'm serious." Her voice rose another level. "You have health problems now. That changes things." "It's a minor issue." "That's what you say." The tension in the room tightened like a pulled rope. Then Melissa stood up. And that's when everything shifted. She looked directly at me and raised her voice. "Maybe it's time you found your own place." No one spoke for a few seconds. Greg stared at the table. The boys froze. I waited. Sometimes people calm down after the first outburst. Melissa didn't. Her voice got sharper. "You heard me." She pointed toward the hallway. "If this situation is going to become a problem, I'm not dealing with it." Greg tried again. "Melissa, relax." She ignored him. Then the sentence came out of her mouth loud enough that the neighbors probably heard it. "Get out of this house." Caleb dropped his fork. Ethan stared at his plate. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I sat there for a moment, not angry, not shocked, just quiet. Years in the army teach you something else besides patience. You learn how to recognize when a situation is already finished. Arguing doesn't fix finished situations. So I stood up. No shouting, no speech, just pushed the chair back and walked down the hallway toward the small guest room I'd been using. Behind me, I could hear Greg saying something to Melissa, but the words blurred together. Inside the room, my suitcase sat in the closet where I'd left it from my last trip. I set it on the bed and started folding clothes. Military habits make packing fast. 10 minutes later, the suitcase was half full. Another few minutes and everything important was inside. I stepped back and looked around the room. 3 months living there and I'd barely unpacked anything. Turns out that was a good instinct. From the hallway, I could hear the low rumble of Melissa and Greg arguing again in the kitchen. Same house, same family, different atmosphere now. I zipped the suitcase closed, picked up my phone from the nightstand. One quick check of my banking app out of habit. The balance looked the same as it had that morning. $12,347,118. I slipped the phone into my pocket, grabbed the suitcase handle, and walked toward the front door. The suitcase rolled quietly across the tile floor as I pulled the front door open. Warm air rushed in from the Florida night. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the yellow glow of porch lights, which felt strange considering what had just happened inside the house behind me. I stepped onto the driveway and set the suitcase upright next to my car. For a moment, I just stood there, not angry, not shocked, mostly calm. Military life does that to you. After enough deployments, arguments, and a kitchen stop feeling like emergencies. Inside the house, I could still hear muffled voices through the walls. Melissa and Greg were arguing again. The boys were probably pretending not to listen. I opened the trunk, lifted the suitcase in, and closed it gently. The sound echoed louder than I expected. 3 months earlier, pulling into that same driveway had felt very different. Back then, I had just arrived from Fort Carson with 2 duffel bags, a small suitcase, and no real plan except to rest for a while. My unit had finished a long rotation supporting supply routes across several bases in Eastern Europe. Nothing dramatic like combat operations, but logistics missions come with their own kind of stress. When something goes wrong with supply chains, the entire military starts paying attention very quickly. When I landed back in the United States, the Army gave me a temporary leave period before my next assignment. That's when Melissa called. She had heard from a cousin that I was back in the country. "You should come stay with us for a while," she said over the phone. "Take a break. The boys would love having you around." It sounded reasonable. Melissa lived in Tampa, not far from MacDill Air Force Base. The neighborhood was quiet. The house had plenty of space, and the timing worked while I waited for reassignment orders. I didn't hesitate long. Family is family. The first week there actually felt nice. Caleb followed me around the house, asking endless questions about the Army. Ethan wanted to know if I'd ever driven a tank. Melissa was friendly in that slightly distracted way people get when their life is already full of schedules and responsibilities. She worked as a real estate agent, which meant half her conversations involved property listings and mortgage rates. Greg mostly stayed out of everything. He worked from home in some kind of IT job and seemed happiest when the television was on and the house stayed quiet. After the second week, I handed Melissa an envelope. $2,500, I told her, for groceries and bills. She looked surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I placed the envelope on the counter anyway. Living with family works better when nobody feels like they're carrying someone else." Melissa didn't argue. By the 3rd month, it had become routine. First week of every month, I placed the envelope in the kitchen drawer where she kept the bills. Nobody talked about it. It just became part of the household rhythm. Most mornings, I woke up early out of habit. Army schedules don't disappear overnight. I'd make coffee before anyone else got up and sit on the back patio, while the Florida humidity slowly turned the sky pink over the rooftops. Sometimes Caleb joined me before school. Other times, Ethan asked for help with math homework, while Melissa rushed around getting ready for showings. Those parts felt normal, almost peaceful, but small things started shifting after a while. Melissa began introducing me to her friends differently. At first, she said things like, "My sister just got back from deployment." Later, it turned into my sister's staying with us for a bit. Then eventually, it became something closer to my sister's figuring things out. The phrasing was subtle, but people in the Army get very good at noticing subtle shifts. Another thing I noticed was how quickly my monthly contributions stopped being a conversation. The envelope simply disappeared from the drawer every month. No questions, no comments, just gone. Which was fine with me. Money had never been the reason I stayed there. The real reason was the boys. Ethan had just started middle school and thought the Army was the coolest thing on earth. Caleb believed I could fix any problem with duct tape and determination. Sometimes after dinner, they'd ask about deployments. Not the dangerous stuff. Kids mostly care about the simple questions. What the food was like, what the trucks looked like, whether soldiers ever got bored. I kept those conversations light. Greg usually sat nearby watching television, while Melissa scrolled through her phone answering client messages. Life moved in comfortable routines, until the doctor appointment 2 weeks earlier. The cardiology check had been routine. Military medical exams happen constantly after deployments. Blood tests, scans, follow-ups. The Army likes data. One of the tests showed a mild irregular heartbeat. Nothing dramatic. No surgery. No hospital stay. The doctor simply recommended monitoring it for a few months. I mentioned it casually during dinner one evening. Greg shrugged. Melissa reacted differently. She started asking detailed questions. How serious was it? Did it require medication? Could it turn into something worse? At the time, I assumed she was just being concerned. Looking back now, that conversation was probably the moment everything changed. Melissa began paying closer attention to my schedule. She asked more questions about follow-up appointments. Once she even asked what would happen if I needed medical treatment while staying there. I remember laughing at the time. It's not that kind of problem. She didn't laugh. Over the next few days, her attitude shifted slightly. Not openly hostile, just tense. The kind of tension people carry when they feel responsible for something they never wanted responsibility for. Tonight at dinner, when Greg asked about the doctor's visit again, that tension finally snapped. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard clock glowed 8:42 p.m. The house still looked calm from the outside. Lights in the kitchen. Shadows moving behind the curtains. You would never guess what had just happened in there. I backed out of the driveway slowly. As the car rolled toward the street, my phone buzzed once in the cup holder. I glanced down. A notification from my bank app had appeared on the screen. The phone buzzed again as the car rolled toward the end of the street. I didn't check it right away. Driving away from a place where someone just told you to leave has a strange effect on your brain. Everything becomes very quiet. Your mind starts sorting through memories automatically, like a filing cabinet opening drawers you didn't ask for. The notification stayed on the screen for a few seconds before disappearing. Just a routine alert from the investment account tied to my main portfolio. Market movement. Nothing unusual. The balance hadn't changed much, still just over 12 million. I turned onto the main road and let the traffic carry me forward. A few hours earlier before dinner, I had been sitting in the small guest room scrolling through emails from the Army Logistics Command. Most of them involved paperwork and scheduling updates. Nothing urgent. That's when I heard Melissa's voice down the hallway. At first, it sounded like a normal phone call. She often talked loudly when discussing real estate deals, so it didn't stand out. But after a minute, something about her tone changed. I wasn't trying to listen. But the guest room sat right next to the kitchen wall, and the house carried sound like a speaker system. "I'm serious," she said. Her voice had that tight edge people get when they're frustrated, but trying to sound reasonable. Whoever she was talking to said something I couldn't hear. Then Melissa answered. "She's been here for months." A pause. "Yes, she gives me money for groceries, but that's not the point." I leaned back on the bed and kept reading emails. Except my brain had already stopped focusing on the screen. Another pause. Then Melissa laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind that carries a little bit of annoyance behind it. "No, she's not struggling exactly," Melissa said. "But she doesn't really have anywhere else to go." That sentence landed differently. I stayed still. Her voice continued drifting through the wall. "I mean, she's Army. What do you expect? They move around all the time." Another pause. Then came the part that made the emails on my phone suddenly meaningless. "She's basically figuring things out right now." My thumb stopped scrolling. The conversation kept going. "She's fine here for now," Melissa said. "But honestly, I don't know how long this arrangement works." Silence on my end of the wall. Then Melissa lowered her voice slightly. "You know how military people are." Another laugh. "They come back from deployments with all kinds of stress and problems." My eyes moved away from the phone screen. The wall between the kitchen and the guest room suddenly felt very thin. She already mentioned some heart thing her doctor found, Melissa said. Nothing huge, but still. I don't want that becoming my problem. The last word carried a sharp edge. Problem, not sister, not family. Problem. The call ended a few minutes later. I stayed sitting on the bed, not angry, just thinking. In the Army, you learn to listen carefully to how people describe situations. The words they choose usually reveal more than the situation itself. Melissa hadn't said anything dramatic. She hadn't called me a burden. She hadn't insulted me. But the tone of that conversation told me something important. To her, my presence in that house had slowly shifted categories, from family to responsibility. And responsibility can turn into inconvenience very quickly. Dinner happened about an hour after that phone call. I remember watching Melissa move around the kitchen while preparing the pasta. Everything about her behavior looked normal. She joked with Caleb about burning the garlic bread. She complained about a client who couldn't decide between two properties. Anyone watching would assume the house was peaceful, but I had already heard the earlier conversation. And once you hear something like that, the atmosphere in the room changes even if nobody else notices. The argument at the dinner table later that night suddenly made more sense. It wasn't about the heart checkup. That was just the excuse. The real issue had been building quietly for weeks. Now the car moved through Tampa traffic while streetlights slid across the windshield. A red light stopped me at the intersection near a gas station. The phone buzzed again in the cup holder. Another financial alert. I glanced down briefly. Still the same numbers. $12 million sitting quietly inside a collection of investment accounts that nobody in my family had ever asked about. Which was fine. I had never volunteered the information. Money changes how people behave, and I had always preferred to see how people behaved without it. The light turned green. I drove another mile before pulling into a small parking lot next to a grocery store that was already closing for the night. The engine shut off. Silence settled inside the car. I leaned back in the seat and looked through the windshield at the empty storefront. The strange part about everything that had happened tonight was how calm I felt. Some people expect dramatic reactions when families fight. Raised voices, anger, doors slamming. But those reactions usually happen when someone believes the situation can still be fixed. Tonight had felt different. Melissa's voice at the dinner table carried a kind of finality, like someone who had already made a decision days earlier and was just delivering it out loud. I picked up the phone and opened the banking app again. The balance appeared instantly. $12,347,118. Years earlier, that number would have shocked me. Now it mostly felt like a tool, a quiet piece of information sitting in the background of my life. I closed the app and set the phone back in the cup holder. For a moment, I considered turning around and going back to the house to talk things through. But the thought faded almost immediately. In the Army, there's a phrase soldiers use during planning meetings. If a mission stops making sense, you don't keep forcing the plan. You change the plan. The house behind me had stopped making sense. So I started the engine again and pulled out of the parking lot. A few blocks down the road, a large real estate billboard stood above the intersection, advertising luxury homes along Tampa Bay. The sign showed a photo of modern waterfront houses with huge windows and palm trees lining the sidewalks. I slowed slightly as the car approached the traffic light beneath the billboard. Then I reached for my phone and opened a real estate search app. The real estate app opened instantly, lighting up the dark interior of the car. For a second, I just stared at the screen. Tampa Bay properties filled the page: waterfront condos, renovated bungalows, houses with wide glass windows facing the bay. Price tags ranged from $500,000 to numbers that made even successful people pause. I didn't pause. I adjusted the search filter and started scrolling. The strange thing about money is that the people who talk about it the most usually have the least of it. The people who actually have it tend to treat it like electricity. Useful, powerful, but not something you wave around in public. My family had never asked many questions about my finances. That was partly my fault. I had never offered many answers. The truth was simple. Long before the Army had become my career, money had quietly become a background detail in my life. It started during my last year of college. Back then I studied supply chain systems and data analytics, which sounded boring to most people, but fascinated me. Logistics is a strange field. When it works perfectly, nobody notices. When it fails, everything collapses. During a class project, 2 classmates and I built a small software tool that optimized shipping routes for large-scale transport networks. The program used simple predictive models to reduce empty miles and cut transportation costs. At first, it was just a class project, but one of our professors had previously worked with a defense contractor. He looked at our code one afternoon and said something that changed everything. "Someone will buy this." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. 6 months later, a mid-sized logistics company licensed the program for testing. A year after that, a defense contractor approached us with a purchase offer. The software wasn't revolutionary. It didn't change the world. But it solved a very specific problem that government logistics teams dealt with every day, predicting where supply trucks should go before anyone realized they needed them there. The contract we signed wasn't front-page news, but it paid well. After taxes and splits between the founders, my share came out to a little over $2 million. At 23 years old, that number felt enormous. Most people would have stayed in tech. I didn't. Instead, I joined the Army. A lot of my friends thought that decision made no sense. Why walk away from a profitable industry to start over as a junior officer making government salary? But logistics inside the military fascinated me even more than civilian supply chains. Moving food, fuel, medical supplies, and equipment across continents required the same kind of thinking as software optimization, just with higher stakes. So I enlisted, went through officer training, and began building a career inside Army logistics. The money from the software deal sat quietly in investment accounts. At first, it grew slowly. Then a financial advisor convinced me to diversify the portfolio. Index funds, infrastructure investments, a handful of defense industry stocks. Nothing flashy, just steady growth. Years passed. Deployments happened. Promotions came and went. The investment portfolio grew in the background like a tree nobody was watching. By the time I returned from my second overseas rotation, the number had crossed 10 million. I never mentioned it to my family. Not because I was hiding something, because money changes conversations. If Melissa had known her younger sister had $8 or $10 million sitting in a portfolio somewhere, every interaction would have been different. Requests would start appearing. Expectations would shift. And eventually, every disagreement would become a financial discussion. I preferred something simpler. Let people treat me like a normal person. At least that way their reactions were honest. The real estate listings on my phone continued sliding upward as I scrolled. Modern homes near West Shore. Renovated properties near Bayshore Boulevard. A waterfront townhouse with large windows overlooking the bay. Prices ranged from $600,000 to over $1 million. My thumb stopped on a listing near West Shore Marina. 3-bedroom house. Recently renovated. Large backyard. Price $685,000. The photos showed wide windows, white walls, and a small patio facing the water. Quiet neighborhood. 10 minutes from downtown Tampa. 15 minutes from the base. The kind of place someone could live comfortably for a long time. I saved the listing. Then another one. And another. Eventually, the phone screen showed a small collection of bookmarked properties. The car sat quietly in the parking lot, while the grocery store across the street shut off its lights one by one. Most people imagine revenge as something loud. Shouting, arguments, dramatic confrontations. But the truth is, the most effective decisions are usually quiet ones. The kind nobody notices until the results appear. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a financial alert. Melissa's name flashed across the screen. Call incoming. I watched it ring for a few seconds. Then the screen went dark. A moment later, it lit up again. Second call. Same name. I let it ring. After the third attempt, the phone switched to voicemail automatically. A text message appeared a few seconds later. Where did you go? Another message followed almost immediately. We need to talk. I placed the phone face down in the cup holder. The dashboard clock read 9:18 p.m. Traffic on the road had thinned to almost nothing. Somewhere nearby, a motorcycle passed its engine, echoing briefly through the quiet intersection. I looked at the real estate listing again. The waterfront house near West Shore. Then I opened the contact page for my financial advisor. His name was Daniel Chen. We had worked together for almost a decade. He answered the phone on the second ring. Harper, he said. Everything okay? Yeah, I replied. A short pause. I'm thinking about buying a house. He chuckled softly. You've been thinking about that for years. Not thinking anymore. Another pause. What price range? I glanced back at the listing on the phone. $600,000 to $700,000. Mortgage or cash? Cash. The line went quiet for half a second. Then Daniel said calmly, That's easy enough. I leaned back in the seat and looked through the windshield again. The empty road stretched toward the bay. I'll also need to review an old family loan agreement, I added. Daniel didn't ask questions. He knew better than most people that quiet decisions often carried the most weight. Send me the details, he said. I ended the call and placed the phone back in the cup holder. A Across the street, the grocery store lights shut off completely. The parking lot went dark. For a moment, the entire block sat in silence. Then I started the car and pulled back onto the road, heading toward the waterfront district where the houses in those listings were located. The waterfront district was quieter than I expected at that hour. Streetlights reflected off the bay in long orange lines, and the air smelled like salt and warm asphalt. Tampa at night had a strange calm to it, not silent but slower, like the city had finally decided to take a breath. I drove past a row of modern townhouses with balconies facing the water. One of them looked almost identical to the photo I had saved earlier. I didn't stop. Looking at houses in the dark never tells you much. Everything looks impressive under streetlights. Instead, I kept driving toward Bayshore Boulevard, the long stretch of road that curves along the water. Palm trees lined the sidewalk, and a few late joggers moved along the path like shadows. My phone buzzed again in the cup holder. Another call from Melissa. I let it ring. Then a text. Are you seriously leaving like this? Another. You can't just disappear. The phone buzzed again almost immediately after that. Greg this time. I ignored that one too. When people suddenly realize they've pushed a situation too far, they tend to talk a lot. Most of that talking is just panic disguised as concern. The car rolled to a stop at a red light overlooking the bay. The water looked dark and flat under the moonlight. For a moment, I imagined what the conversation inside Melissa's house probably looked like right now. Greg pacing the kitchen. Melissa realizing the argument had gone further than she expected. The boys asking questions nobody wanted to answer. It wasn't my job to solve that situation anymore. The light turned green. I drove another mile before pulling into a quiet waterfront parking area near a public dock. A few empty benches faced the water, and a small group of fishermen stood near the end of the pier under portable lights. I parked the car and stepped out. The air felt cooler near the water. For the first time since leaving the house, I stretched my arms and rolled my shoulders slightly. The tension from the dinner argument had finally started to fade. Deployment life trains you to think about logistics constantly. Where you sleep, where you move next, what resources you have available. Standing there beside the car, those same instincts began working automatically. Step 1, temporary housing. That part was easy. Tampa had plenty of high-end hotels near the waterfront. Any of them would work for a few nights while I looked at properties in person. Step 2, schedule real estate visits. Also easy. Step 3, organize financial documents for the purchase. Daniel could handle most of that remotely. Step 4, I leaned against the hood of the car and looked out across the water again. Step 4 involved something I hadn't thought about for a while. Family finances. 3 years earlier, when Melissa and Greg bought their current house, they ran into a problem during the closing process. The bank approved their mortgage, but the down payment and renovation costs stretched their savings too thin. Melissa called me late one evening. Her voice sounded stressed in that controlled way people use when they're trying not to sound desperate. We're just short, she said. How short? About $100,000. I remember sitting in a small apartment outside Fort Carson while she explained the situation. The house needed immediate repairs. Roof work, kitchen updates, landscaping, things that banks never want to finance. I didn't hesitate. I can help, I told her. Melissa sounded relieved. 2 weeks later, I transferred $120,000 to their closing account. But before the transfer, Daniel had suggested something. Family loans should still be documented, he told me during a phone call, even if you never expect repayment. Why, I asked. Taxes, he said simply. And then he explained the concept of a promissory note, a simple legal agreement stating that the money was technically a loan. Low interest, flexible repayment schedule, mostly paperwork. Melissa signed it without much thought. At the time, I didn't think much about it either. The document went into Daniel's digital files and disappeared from my attention. Family rarely keeps track of paperwork like that. I pushed away from the car and walked toward the dock. The fishermen nodded as I passed them, but nobody said anything. The water moved slowly against the wooden posts. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Melissa. Please call me. Another. Harper, this is ridiculous. Another. You can't just walk away. I opened the phone this time and read them. Then I scrolled back through the earlier messages. They started polite, then concerned. Now the tone was shifting toward frustration. Interesting how quickly people move through emotional stages once control disappears. I closed the messaging app and opened my email. Daniel had already responded to the message I sent earlier. 2 attachments sat in the inbox. The first was a summary of liquid funds available for immediate transfer. The second was a scanned document, the promissory note from 3 years earlier. I opened the file. Melissa's signature sat at the bottom of the page. The terms were simple. Principal, $120,000, interest 4% annually. Repayment term flexible with a clause allowing full repayment if requested by the lender. Standard financial protection. Daniel had always been careful like that. At the time, it felt unnecessary. Now it felt like a piece of information that had quietly waited in the background for years. The fishermen at the end of the dock started packing up their gear. One of them carried a cooler toward the parking lot. Another switched off the portable light. The dock grew darker. I zoomed in slightly on the signature at the bottom of the document. Melissa Sullivan. Clear and unmistakable. 3 years earlier, she had signed it with a quick laugh and a comment about legal paperwork nonsense. I closed the file and returned to the real estate listings. The West Shore house appeared again at the top of the saved list. 3 bedrooms, large windows, water view, price $685,000. I tapped the contact button beneath the listing. A realtor's name appeared, Diane Morrison. Phone number below it. The fishermen finished loading their truck and drove away from the parking lot. The dock lights shut off automatically a few seconds later. Dark water stretched across the bay. I stood there looking at the listing for another moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang twice before the realtor answered. Diane Morrison. Her voice sounded alert in that professional way people develop after years in real estate. Hi, I said. I'm calling about a property in West Shore. 3 bedrooms, white exterior, listed at $685,000. A brief pause followed. Then she said, Yes, I know the one. Are you interested in scheduling a viewing? I am. Tomorrow morning work for you. That works. 10 o'clock. Perfect. She started explaining parking instructions and access details, but the conversation stayed simple. Realtors don't waste time with small talk when someone sounds serious. Before hanging up, she asked the standard question. Will you be financing or paying cash? Cash. That created a half-second pause on the line. Then she said, Understood. I'll bring the paperwork. The call ended. I stood at the edge of the dock for another moment before walking back to the car. The drive to the hotel took less than 15 minutes. Tampa has plenty of waterfront hotels designed for business travelers and tourists with expense accounts. I picked one near downtown with large glass windows and a lobby that smelled like expensive candles. The receptionist checked me in without questions. People staying in places like that rarely get asked many questions. The room overlooked the bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water, and a long line of lights stretched across the bridge in the distance. I dropped the suitcase near the bed and sat down in the chair beside the window. For the first time all evening, I checked my phone messages again. Melissa had stopped texting. That usually means one of 2 things. Either someone has decided to calm down, or someone is preparing a new argument. I set the phone aside and opened the financial summary Daniel sent earlier. Liquid accounts alone held more than enough to buy several houses like the one I plan to see tomorrow. Money has a strange effect when you stop thinking about it as a goal and start treating it as a tool. It becomes quieter, more practical, less emotional. That night I slept better than expected. Army life trains your body to fall asleep almost anywhere. The next morning, Tampa looked completely different. Sunlight reflected off the water and filled the hotel room with bright white light. I showered, dressed, and drove toward West Shore. The neighborhood Diane had mentioned sat just a few blocks from the marina. Tree-lined streets, modern houses mixed with older renovated ones, quiet sidewalks. The kind of area where people walked dogs in the morning while holding expensive coffee cups. Diane waited outside the property when I arrived. She looked exactly like most experienced realtors in Florida. Professional clothes, sunglasses, clipboard, confident posture. You must be Harper, she said. That's me. We shook hands. The house looked even better in daylight. White exterior walls, large black-framed windows, clean landscaping, simple but modern. Built 5 years ago, Diane explained while unlocking the front door. The previous owners relocated to Atlanta. They want a quick sale. Inside, the house felt open and bright. Natural light filled the living room. The kitchen had modern appliances and a large island. The back patio faced a quiet stretch of water connected to the bay. I walked through each room slowly. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms upstairs, office space downstairs. Plenty of room without feeling oversized. Military housing teaches you to evaluate spaces quickly. Is it practical? Is it quiet? Does it work? This place checked every box. Diane finished her standard explanation and watched my reaction carefully. So she asked, "What do you think?" "I like it." She smiled. "Most people do." We stepped out onto the back patio. A small breeze moved across the water. "This property has had a lot of interest," she said carefully. "But serious buyers usually need mortgage approval." I leaned on the patio railing and looked across the canal. How quickly could the sellers close? If the buyer is paying cash, yes, 2 weeks, she said. Maybe faster. I nodded once. "Let's do it." Her sunglasses lowered slightly as she studied my face. "Full asking price." "Yes. $685. That's fine." She opened the folder on her clipboard and began pulling out forms. Real estate contracts look intimidating, but most of them follow the same structure. Offer. Inspection clause. Closing timeline. I signed where she indicated. Diane checked the paperwork once more before placing it back in the folder. "I'll contact the sellers today," she said. "They'll accept," I replied. She laughed softly. Cash buyers tend to get attention. Before leaving, she asked the final practical question. "Where should we send the closing instructions?" I gave her Daniel's email address. "He'll handle the financial side." She wrote it down. Then we shook hands again. As I walked back toward my car, the house stood quietly behind me. Sunlight reflected off the windows. For the first time since leaving Melissa's house the night before, something inside me settled. Not satisfaction, just clarity. Somewhere across town, Melissa was probably still explaining the situation to Greg, trying to understand why her sister packed a suitcase and left without arguing, trying to figure out what happened. The answer was simple. People reveal their real priorities when pressure appears. Melissa had revealed hers. I opened the car door and sat down behind the wheel. My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Daniel," I answered. "Offer accepted already?" he asked. "They will." He chuckled. "I'm transferring the funds now. Closing documents should reach the realtor by this afternoon." "Good." He hesitated for a second. "Anything else you want me to review?" "Yes," I said. "The family loan." A quiet pause followed. "I remember that file," Daniel replied. "Melissa's promissory note. I'd like to activate the repayment clause." Daniel didn't react with surprise. Financial advisors rarely do. "You want the full balance?" "Yes." "Understood." I started the car and pulled away from the curb. Traffic moved steadily through the neighborhood. Palm trees passed slowly outside the window. Daniel spoke again. "I'll prepare the formal notice." "Thank you." Out of curiosity, he added, "Does your sister know you just bought a waterfront house?" "Number." He laughed softly. "Something tells me she's about to learn a lot of new information." The closing documents arrived faster than most people expect. Cash purchases tend to move quickly when everyone involved understands the timeline. By Thursday morning, the funds had already transferred. The sellers had signed their side and the property officially changed hands. 5 days. That was all it took. The first time I unlocked the front door as the owner, the house felt different from the viewing earlier that week. Not dramatically different, just quieter. Ownership does that. The moment a place becomes yours, your brain stops evaluating it and starts imagining life inside it. The moving company delivered my suitcase and a few boxes from the hotel that afternoon. I didn't own much furniture in Tampa yet, which made the house feel large and open. The living room echoed slightly when I walked across the hardwood floor. That didn't bother me. Empty space has never felt uncomfortable to someone who spent years living out of military duffel bags. I opened the windows along the back wall and let the warm Florida air move through the house. The canal water behind the property moved slowly in the sunlight. A small boat passed in the distance. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Daniel." "The notice went out," he said when I answered. "Already. Certified mail. Your sister should receive it tomorrow." He paused briefly. I reviewed the numbers again. With accumulated interest, the total balance is a little over $130,000. "That's fine." "You want the full amount requested?" "Yes." Daniel understood the tone. He didn't ask for explanations. "I'll monitor the response," he said before ending the call. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked through the house again. Kitchen, living room, upstairs hallway. The office space looked perfect for working remotely or reviewing logistics reports from the Army. The backyard patio faced the water, a quiet place to sit with coffee. By late afternoon, I had ordered basic furniture deliveries online. Nothing fancy, just the kind of practical pieces that make a house livable. A couch, dining table, office desk. Army life teaches you how little you actually need. Across town, Melissa's afternoon was going very differently. I didn't hear the full story until later, but the sequence was simple. The certified envelope arrived around noon. Legal envelopes tend to stand out in ordinary mail. They carry a certain weight even before you open them. Melissa signed for it without thinking much about the sender. The return address listed Daniel's law office. She opened the envelope at the kitchen counter. Inside sat 3 documents. The first explained the repayment clause being activated. The second summarized the outstanding balance. The third included a copy of the original promissory note. Her signature appeared clearly at the bottom of the page. Melissa called Greg immediately. By the time Greg arrived home 20 minutes later, the documents were spread across the kitchen table. He read them slowly. Then he read them again. "Is this real?" he asked. Melissa apparently answered with the same confusion most people experience when paperwork they once ignored suddenly becomes very important. She said it was just for taxes, Melissa told him. Greg tapped the signature line. "This says loan." Melissa didn't have a response for that. At some point, Greg asked the obvious question, "Why now?" Melissa's answer probably came out slowly, because the previous night she had screamed at her sister to leave the house. Meanwhile, I spent most of that afternoon assembling furniture. The couch arrived first. 2 delivery guys carried the boxes inside and asked the usual questions about room placement. An hour later, the dining table showed up. By evening, the house looked less empty. The sun started lowering over the water outside the back windows. I carried a cup of coffee onto the patio and sat in one of the temporary folding chairs the movers had left behind. The canal had become busier now. 2 kayakers paddled past slowly. A couple walked a dog along the sidewalk across the water. Normal life continued. My phone buzzed again around 6. This time the caller ID showed Melissa's name. I answered. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then she spoke. "What is this?" Her voice sounded tight. "Hello to you too," I replied calmly. "Harper. I just received a letter from some lawyer saying I owe you money." "You do?" Another silence. "That was a gift." "No," I said. "It wasn't." "You told me it was." I said I would help. Her breathing became louder on the phone. Greg's voice appeared faintly in the background asking questions. Melissa covered the microphone briefly before returning. "You're actually trying to take money from us," she said. I leaned back in the chair and looked out across the water. "You signed the agreement?" "That was paperwork." "Yes." "For taxes?" "Yes." "But it was still paperwork you signed." Melissa's frustration turned into anger quickly. "This is insane." "No," I replied. "It's documentation." Another pause followed. Then Melissa asked the question she probably should have asked years earlier. "Why are you doing this?" I considered the answer for a moment. "Because you told me to leave your house." "That has nothing to do with this." "It actually has everything to do with it." Her voice dropped slightly. "You're punishing us. I'm collecting a loan. You don't even need the money." I smiled slightly at that sentence. Interesting assumption. Greg's voice grew louder in the background. Melissa turned away from the phone again. Then she came back. "You think you can just ruin us financially because of one argument?" "I didn't ruin anything," I said. "I gave you a loan 3 years ago." "You're unbelievable." Another silence. Then Melissa asked quietly, "Where are you even staying right now?" "In Tampa." "That's not an answer. It's enough of one." The canal water moved slowly beneath the fading sunlight. A breeze crossed the patio. Melissa spoke again. "You're being petty." "Maybe. You know we can't pay that kind of money immediately." "There's a 90-day window," I said. "Talk to Greg. Look at your options." Her voice rose again. "This is unbelievable." I listened for another second before responding. "Melissa." "What?" "You told me to get out of your house." She didn't answer. I watched the last bit of sunlight reflect off the water before adding one more sentence. "And I did." The silence on the phone stretched for a few seconds after I said that. Then Melissa hung up. No goodbye. No last argument. Just the hollow click of someone realizing a situation had moved past the point where yelling could fix it. I stayed on the patio for another minute, watching the water move slowly through the canal. The air smelled like salt and warm wood from the dock. Eventually, I stood up and walked back inside. The house felt comfortable in a quiet, practical way. Boxes still sat in corners, waiting to be unpacked, but the place already felt more stable than the guest room I had been living in. I poured another cup of coffee and opened my laptop on the kitchen island. Emails from the Army Logistics Command had already started arriving. Deployment reports, planning updates, supply chain reviews. Even while on temporary assignment status, officers rarely disappear completely from the system. I answered a few messages, reviewed a document about fuel distribution across several European bases, made a few notes. Work has a way of resetting your brain after emotional conversations. Meanwhile, across town, Melissa and Greg were having a very different evening. Later, I would learn the details from someone who knew them both socially. The moment Melissa hung up the phone, Greg demanded to see the paperwork again. They spread the documents across the kitchen table. Principal amount, interest, repayment clause, legal signatures. Greg read everything carefully this time. "This is a real loan," he said finally. Melissa rubbed her forehead. "She told me it was just paperwork." Greg pointed at the signature again. "You signed it." Melissa didn't answer. Most financial problems start exactly that way. A decision someone barely remembers making. Greg opened his laptop. "How much is it now?" Melissa looked at the letter again. 132,000. Greg stared at the number. "That's not something we can just pay." They both knew that. Their mortgage alone cost nearly $4,000 every month. Between school expenses, utilities, car payments, and everyday costs, their finances didn't leave room for sudden six-figure obligations. Greg opened their banking app. Savings balance appeared on the screen. $28,000. That's everything he asked. Melissa nodded slowly. Greg leaned back in the chair. "We need a loan." Melissa immediately shook her head. "From who?" Greg didn't answer right away. Then he said something that probably sounded logical at the time. "The bank." The next morning, Melissa scheduled a meeting. Banks have a very consistent way of handling situations like this. They look at income. They review debts. They evaluate collateral. Then they calculate risk. Melissa and Greg sat across from a loan officer in a small glass office near the front of the bank branch. The officer reviewed the documents slowly. Mortgage balance, credit cards, car loans, income statements. Finally, she placed the promissory note on the desk. "This is legally enforceable," she said. Greg nodded. "Yes." "And the repayment clause has already been activated." "Yes." The loan officer folded her hands. "You could potentially refinance the house," she said. Melissa leaned forward immediately. "Yes, exactly. But there's a complication." "What complication?" "The promissory note creates a lien situation." Greg frowned. "A what?" The officer pointed at the document. "If this loan was recorded properly, the lender can claim repayment priority." Greg's expression slowly changed. "You mean Harper?" "Yes." Silence filled the office. Melissa asked the question quietly. "So we can't refinance, not without resolving this debt first." Greg leaned back again. "That makes no sense." The officer kept her tone calm. "It makes perfect sense legally." Melissa stared at the desk. For the first time, the reality of the situation began settling in. The loan wasn't theoretical. It wasn't emotional. It was a contract. And contracts don't care about family arguments. That afternoon, they visited another bank. The answer stayed the same. Debt first. Refinance later. Greg drove home in silence. Melissa stared out the passenger window the entire way. When they reached the house, Greg parked the car but didn't turn off the engine immediately. "How did we not know about this?" he asked. Melissa finally spoke. "She never said anything." Greg looked at her. "You never asked." That evening, the tension inside the house spread quickly. The boys noticed it first. Kids always do. Caleb asked why dinner was late. Ethan asked why Greg wasn't talking. Melissa tried to act normal while cooking. But stress shows in small ways. A dropped plate, a forgotten ingredient, a conversation that stops halfway through a sentence. Later that night, Greg opened his laptop again. He started researching repayment options, short-term loans, private lenders, debt consolidation. Every solution came with interest rates that made the situation worse. Melissa watched him scroll through the results. Finally, she asked the question that had been building in her mind all day. Why is she doing this? Greg didn't look up from the screen. Because we told her to leave. Melissa crossed her arms. That doesn't justify ruining us. Greg finally turned toward her. You called her a sick burden in front of the kids. Melissa's face tightened. That was during an argument. Greg closed the laptop. It still happened. The room went quiet. In the living room, the television played quietly while the boys watched a movie. Normal sounds. Normal life. Except the financial pressure had already started tightening around everything. Greg eventually spoke again. We should call her. Melissa shook her head. She won't answer. We still need to try. Across town, my evening stayed far less dramatic. The furniture deliveries had finished. The house felt calmer with a few more pieces in place. I walked through each room once more before settling in the office. The desk faced a window overlooking the water. Perfect for working. Perfect for thinking. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. Loan notice delivered successfully. Monitoring response. I typed a short reply. Understood. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID showed Greg's name. The phone kept vibrating on the desk for a few seconds before I picked it up. Greg's name sat on the screen. I answered. Harper, he said immediately. His voice sounded calmer than Melissa's had earlier. We need to talk. I assumed that. Another pause. Melissa is upset. That's not surprising. Greg let out a long breath. She didn't realize the paperwork was real. I know. Silence followed for a moment. Greg seemed to be choosing his words carefully. You have to understand, he said she thought the money was a gift. I helped you buy the house, I replied. That part was real. But activating the repayment clause, you told me to leave your house. Greg hesitated. That was Melissa. You didn't disagree. Another pause stretched across the line. Greg eventually spoke again. Look, we're not saying we handled things perfectly. That's one way to describe it. But this amount of money, he continued, it's not something we can produce quickly. I gave you 90 days. That's still not enough. I leaned back in the chair and watched a small boat move slowly across the canal outside the window. Then you should probably start planning. Greg sounded frustrated now. Harper, this doesn't have to turn into a war. It isn't a war. It feels like one. That's because you're just now realizing the situation. Greg exhaled again. Melissa wants to see you. Number. She needs to explain. Number. Another silence. Then Greg asked the question that had probably been sitting in his mind all day. Where are you staying? In Tampa. That's not helpful. It wasn't meant to be. Greg's voice hardened slightly. You're acting like a stranger. I looked around the office. The new desk. The large windows. The quiet water outside. You made me one, I said. Greg didn't answer. After a moment, he said, We're coming to talk to you. I wouldn't recommend that. Why not? Because you don't know where I am. Greg responded immediately. Melissa has friends all over Tampa. It won't take long. I smiled slightly. Good luck. Then I ended the call. For a few minutes, the house stayed completely quiet again. I returned to reviewing logistics reports on the laptop. But around 20 minutes later, the phone buzzed with another message. Daniel, small update. Melissa's real estate office contacted property records today. I typed back. Meaning, they searched for new property purchases under your name. I looked up at the windows facing the canal. They found it. Probably. Daniel added one more message. Expect visitors. He was right. About 40 minutes later, headlights appeared through the front windows. A white SUV pulled slowly into the driveway. I recognized it immediately. Melissa stepped out first. Greg followed. They stood in the driveway for a moment, staring at the house. From the outside, it probably looked very different from what they expected. The windows, the water behind the property, the quiet street. Melissa walked toward the front door quickly. Greg followed a few steps behind. The doorbell rang. I closed the laptop and walked through the living room. Opening the door revealed Melissa standing there with her arms folded tightly. Greg looked exhausted. Melissa spoke first. What is this place? My house. She stared past me into the living room. You bought a house? Yes. Greg looked around slowly. When? This week. Melissa stepped forward into the doorway without waiting for an invitation. You can't afford this. I almost laughed. Interesting assumption. She pointed toward the water behind the house. This place is easily $600,000. Close. Melissa turned back toward me. Where did you get that kind of money? I crossed my arms. Investments. Greg frowned. What investments? The kind people make when they plan ahead. Melissa shook her head. That's not possible. Why? Because you're Army. Yes. And you were living in our guest room. Yes. Greg looked around the house again. Then he asked quietly, how much? I didn't answer immediately. Melissa repeated the question. How much money do you actually have? I leaned against the door frame. A little over 12 million. The words landed in the air like something heavy. Melissa blinked twice. Greg looked confused. That's not funny. I'm not joking. Melissa stepped back slightly. You're lying. Number. Greg stared at me. Then why were you living with us? Because you invited me. Melissa's voice rose. You had $12 million, and you let us believe you were struggling. I never said I was struggling. You never corrected us. You never asked. Greg rubbed his forehead. This makes no sense. Melissa looked around the house again. The windows. The patio. The quiet canal. Then she whispered something almost to herself. Oh my God. I watched the realization settle across her face. Every moment from the last 3 years suddenly looked different to her. The envelopes of money I gave her every month. The loan for the house. The quiet lifestyle. Greg asked the next question slowly. You could have bought 10 houses like ours. Yes. Melissa stared directly at me. And you still activated the loan. Yes. Her voice shook with anger. You're doing this just to punish us. Number. Then why? I stepped slightly aside so they could see the entire living room behind me. You told me to get out of your house, I said calmly. Melissa didn't respond. Greg looked from me to the water behind the property. Then back again. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, Melissa spoke again. You could destroy us with that money. I shrugged. You're the ones who thought I was a burden. Melissa stood in the doorway, staring at me like she was trying to solve a math problem that suddenly had the wrong numbers. Greg finally spoke. You had $12 million, and you were giving us money every month. Yes. Melissa turned toward him. You knew about that. Greg shook his head slowly. Number. Her voice rose again. So you were testing us. I didn't answer immediately. Outside, the water in the canal moved slowly against the dock. A small boat passed somewhere farther out, its engine humming softly through the quiet neighborhood. I wasn't testing anything, I said. Melissa crossed her arms. Then what do you call it? I was living with my family. That's not what it looks like now. Greg stepped forward into the living room. The sunlight coming through the large windows made the house feel even brighter than before. He looked around again, probably calculating the value of everything he saw. You could have helped us, he said quietly. I did. With what? The house you're living in. Melissa shook her head again. You gave us $120,000. Yes, that's nothing compared to $12 million. That depends on how you look at it. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. You're seriously going to collect that loan? Yes. Melissa's voice sharpened again. You're destroying your own family. No, I replied calmly. I'm enforcing a contract. Her eyes flashed. You're being cold. I'm being consistent. Greg looked from Melissa to me. Harper, he said carefully. People make mistakes. They do. And last night was a mistake. Last night was honesty. Melissa opened her mouth to argue but stopped, because we both knew exactly what she had said. The words were still hanging there between us. Get out of this house. She looked away toward the canal. You're really gonna do this, she said quietly. Yes. Greg walked slowly toward the kitchen island and rested his hands on the counter. How long did you know about the loan clause, he asked. 3 years. And you never mentioned it. You never asked. Melissa suddenly laughed once, not happily. You're unbelievable. I shrugged. That's one opinion. The room fell silent again. For a moment, the only sound came from the breeze moving through the open windows. Greg eventually spoke again. What happens if we can't pay? You refinance the house. The bank said the loan blocks that. Then you sell. Melissa turned toward me sharply. You're seriously telling us to sell our house? It's an option. Her voice cracked slightly. The boys grew up there. They'll survive. Melissa looked at me like she had never seen me before. You don't care. That's not true. Then why are you doing this? I walked past them toward the large windows facing the water. Sunlight reflected across the canal, filling the room with moving light. I care about something else, I said. Like what Melissa asked. Respect. Greg didn't say anything. Melissa looked down at the floor. You think we don't respect you? You didn't. That was one argument. It was one honest moment. Neither of them had an answer for that. I turned back toward them. 3 years, I said. 3 years I lived in your house. Greg nodded slightly. Yes? I paid you every month. You insisted. You accepted. Melissa's face tightened. That's not the same thing. It is. Greg looked tired now. You're making a point, he said. Yes. And the point is what? That people treat you differently when they think you need them. Melissa sat down at the kitchen stool suddenly. You're punishing us. No, I said again. I'm correcting a misunderstanding. Greg looked up. What misunderstanding? You thought I needed your house. Melissa stared at me. And you didn't. Number. You could have left any time. Yes. Greg asked the obvious question. Then why didn't you? I looked at him for a moment. Because I wanted to spend time with my nephews. Melissa's shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time since arriving, her anger faded. You still could, she said quietly. I do. Greg frowned. What does that mean? It means my relationship with Ethan and Caleb isn't part of this argument. Melissa looked up again. You'd still see them? Yes. Greg asked another question. What about the money? The loan stands. Melissa shook her head slowly. This is insane. No, I said. This is accountability. Greg looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked something different. What happens to the rest of your money? My estate? Yes. I leaned against the counter. I updated my will yesterday. Melissa blinked. You what? Most of it goes to charities and a trust fund. Greg frowned. For who? Ethan and Caleb. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. You're giving money to the boys? Yes. How much? Enough to pay for college. Probably more. Greg exhaled slowly. And us. You're in the will. Melissa leaned forward. How much? 100,000. Her jaw tightened. Out of 12 million. Yes. That's nothing. That's perspective. Greg looked thoughtful now. You're making a point again. Yes. What point this time? That family shouldn't be valued based on inheritance. Melissa looked down again. You think that's what we did? I know it is. Silence filled the room again. Outside, the sun had started lowering across the canal. The water turned orange under the evening light. Greg finally pushed himself away from the counter. We should go, he said quietly. Melissa didn't move at first. Then she stood slowly. At the door, she turned back toward me. You really changed everything over one sentence. I shook my head slightly. Number. Then what? I met her eyes. You did. They stepped outside without saying anything else. The SUV engine started a moment later. Headlights moved across the front windows before disappearing down the quiet street. The house fell silent again. I walked back toward the patio and stepped outside. The canal reflected the evening sky in long strips of orange and blue. Somewhere across the water, a family laughed on their dock. Normal life continued. Inside the house, the desk in my office waited with a stack of logistics reports from the Army. Tomorrow, I would review them. The day after that, I had a mentoring session scheduled with a group of veterans starting small businesses in Tampa. The calendar was full, but the house stayed quiet. And for the first time in a long time, everything about that quiet felt exactly right. The house stayed quiet long after their car disappeared down the street. I stood on the patio watching the last light fade across the water. The canal moved slowly the same way it had every evening since I moved in. Boats passed, neighbors walked their dogs, and somewhere across the water, someone turned on music that drifted softly through the air. Nothing dramatic had happened. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a few honest conversations and the consequences that followed them. People often imagine revenge as something loud and emotional. But the truth is much simpler. Most real family revenge stories aren't about destroying someone. They're about restoring balance after someone forgets what respect looks like. Melissa learned something that night, not about money, about choices. One sentence can change a relationship. One moment of honesty can reveal what people truly believe. And once that truth appears, you can't pretend it never happened. I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped pretending that disrespect was normal. The house behind me, the water in front of me, the quiet life I built after years in the military, all of it reminded me of one thing. Peace is expensive, not in dollars, in boundaries. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a family drama is walk away, rebuild your life, and let people live with the consequences of their own decisions. If you enjoy real family revenge stories, military life lessons, and powerful family drama like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories where respect, accountability, and real-life decisions collide in ways people never expect. And sometimes the quietest decisions create the biggest consequences.